Those who know the name Dark Shadows only as a 2012 film directed by Tim Burton and starring Johnny Depp will likely have heard but do not realize that some people of a certain age remember fondly the name Dark Shadows as a gothic soap opera that originally aired weekdays on the ABC television network from June 27, 1966 to April 2nd, 1971. The show was created by Dan Curtis, who later went on to produce a number of film adaptations of 19th century novels such as Dracula and ultimately the sprawling miniseries The Winds of War and War and Remembrance. My name's Rob Chamberlain, and I should point out that today's date is March 22nd, 2013. I was a very big fan of the original series, which was revived in 1991 as a nighttime serial and again as an unreleased pilot in 2004. And I am incredibly pleased to have discovered that one of the directors of the original series, Sean Sullivan, who directed 49 episodes of one of my favorite story arcs from the show in 1968, is living here in Abingdon, Virginia. Mr. Sullivan has generously agreed to discuss his involvement with the series, and I'm pleased to introduce Sean Sullivan. Sean, thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for hosting me here. You're providing me with wonderful facilities, a television studio, my Lord. That's where I spent over 40 years of my life working in Manhattan for ABC TV. I had a brief period before that working for an advertising agency in their radio TV department. And then after I left ABC in 1985, I did some more freelance working in television show production and direction. But apparently the focal point for this talk today, and of course I'm privy to some very private and private information about the subject of the show, which is to be apparently Dark Shadows, perhaps.
Right.
Is that all you're going to talk about?
Well, whatever you want to talk about. But I did want to know, I mean, you worked for ABC for
Yes.
over 30 years. And how did you find yourself in the director's chair for Dark Shadows?
Well, I found that occurring by virtue of my having been associate director on the show. And that was a pretty busy experience, 5 days a week. And we started the day with a dry rehearsal in the studio. That was not the TV studio; it was just any room that we could use. It was a studio, and we would have tapes on the floor that would indicate where the walls of the set would be when we got into the set. And you know that you can't go out that way because there's going to be a door there and not there. So I went to ABC as a stage manager in 1951. And I had the fun then of working on a number of shows, one of which I did not realize how prophetic this would be in terms of my own career, since the 4th of May, send me a gift please, I will be 92, but I worked in my first year in television in a show called Life Begins at 80. And I could talk about that if you wanted, but I'm not sure. I worked on very many different kinds of shows, on news shows, on some sports shows. And one of the most interesting experiences that I had actually was in the month of September in 1960. And that was the first time that most of the major heads of countries that belong to the United Nations were going to appear at the United Nations headquarters, which was, located just off First Avenue in New York, not very far from 44th Street, I think. But what I want to tell you is that at this particular time, I was representing the news department, and ABC had a little studio that just overlooked this large room that everybody called the Golden Room. The whole thing was done in gold. foretelling perhaps some pecuniary difficulties they might come into, not getting the proper allotment from the United States, which apparently was very stubborn. But on this particular occasion, Harold Macmillan, Prime Minister of England, was there. Charles de Gaulle, the head of France, was there. And Mr. Adenauer, the head of Germany, was there. George O'Day was there. President Eisenhower was there. And something that was a wonderful surprise was that Fidel Castro was there. And so I will never forget being in the studio when Khrushchev, from Russia, did a famous scene, as shown on television many times, of pounding on the desk with his shoe. He took his shoe off and was banging on the desk, trying to get attention. And that was the occasion in which he gave that very stirring line, "We're going to bury you," which, particularly the right-wing press, just hung on and exploited, because it's true that we really did need to worry about these Russians. Look what he said. And they were bringing this up all the time. And
which apparently was a mistranslation, really. I mean, what he actually said was something like, "We will outlive you," which was, and he was wrong about that, of course.
But I think perhaps he did actually use those words about burying you, because I saw that described by one reporter as a Russian idiom. We have lots of, we say things like, "Oh," liking something we say in the old days, "Oh, that's the cat's meow." Now, what would a Russian think of us saying that? "Oh, wow, that's the cat's meow." It could be very, very, very misleading, because we're not talking about cats at all. But anyway, it was an interesting experience to see these people there. Obviously, I was there for an entire month, which is wonderful, because this was foreign territory, and I didn't have to pay a city income tax. I didn't have to pay a state income tax. There are all sorts of taxes I didn't have to pay for a whole month. It's absolutely wonderful. But one of the things that I remember and could never forget sort of indicates the way reportage follows the bias of the reporter and the publisher, and does not represent actually the real situation. Because I remember the New York Daily News came out with a story about how Fidel Castro managed to bore his audience for 2 hours. You probably know he was famous for the length of his speeches. He could talk forever, but the interesting thing to me was that after he had been talking for over an hour, and he was speaking in Spanish, which I didn't understand, he apparently told the joke. And people in the audience, of course, had headsets with running translation. And the entire room burst into laughter. And I said to myself and to other people, if he were really boring these people, they wouldn't have laughed. They would be snoring. And you have to pay attention to what people tell you about a given event. But
back to Dark Shadows. How did you wind up as the directing Dark Shadows?
Forget about Khrushchev. Let's talk about interesting stuff. I was assigned to the show in the early part of its run in 1966. And as you've already indicated, it went off the air in April of 1971. And I remained working on that show for almost getting very far into 1968, which was a very interesting experience. And there was a big challenge for ABC at the time, because, as you know, it's a spook show, really. You can categorize it that way if you want. But a spook show, I think by definition, should be done only in black and white. And the network felt, these program directors and so on felt, oh, well, CBS is doing color, NBC's, everybody's doing color. We have to take Dark Shadows into the world of color, which I thought was a colossal mistake. you cannot create a dark, pardon my using the word dark, it's very applicable, although it's in shades of gray. You can't create that sense of darkness aesthetically in color anywhere nearly so well as you can in black and white. Black and white leaves you free to imagine. A woman walks into a room and you can imagine what color that is. It blue? Suppose that's your favorite. Maybe it may be mauve. Maybe that's a favorite color. But you try to dress what you see on a black and white screen. And you can't do that with color. Color is so literal. I thought to myself at the time when I went to color, it was a big mistake. I still do. The storylines were good. It was a show that was done with infinite care about technical things. The dressing of the set, as you know, dressing on the set, I know you know this, but maybe the audience isn't aware. The word dressing just applies to whatever is there in the way of scenery. This is part of the dressing of this particular set that we're on. The dressing of the set was meticulous. It was beautifully done. The lighting was superb. The costuming was done with great sensitivity. The actors had the challenge that all actors have in a show of that type, because they really don't have a lot of rehearsal time. It's very short time that they have. They start with a dry rehearsal in the morning in a room that's not like the studio itself where the show will be done, but we have tape markings on the floor about where the set will be. And in this particular case, if I want to walk off the set that way, I better not walk that way because there's no door there. The door's up here. And so with the tape on the floor, we mark out where the door is. And occasionally, for instance, there'd be marks on the floor indicating where this table is. That is one of the things that a stage manager has to supervise and get down very accurate from the layout given by the scenic designer. We had a scenic designer who was a near genius. He was very, very, very good.
Is that Cy Thomasoff?
Yes. Well, he wasn't the only one. There were others. There was another one named Jack Blackman, who was a superb designer. He was wonderful. But the music, a lot of the music was composed originally for just this show by a man named Irving Rabinowitz. And there were other pieces of music they were able to get in the public domain. Naturally, they avoided paying royalties as much as they could. And for reasons of finance as well as for aesthetic reasons, it was very useful to have somebody that did our own music.
Now, Harry Bensonov, in his book on Dark Shadows, says that the sound effects and music cues likely occurred during the production.
Oh, yes.
Is that the case?
That one thing, that one of the things, for instance, I was an associate director for a great time. As a matter of fact, I was an associate director for more shows than I was as a full director. But that is where, in essence, I learned my role, what it was supposed to be, because then I would be sitting next to the director and see what he does and see the way he marks up his script, having to prepare myself for marking up a script in a similar way. The director typically would arrive at this dry rehearsal. Remember, I said not in the studio itself. And the actors came, we hope, having learned their lines. There was a big problem about with the cast about their having studied their lines. Sometimes they were a little bit lazy about it, and they really weren't well honed on their parts. And so at one point, the producer got very angry about this, and up to that point, they had teleprompters. And I think all of them turned many different shades of white, yellow, and green. When the word came down from up above, there would be no more teleprompters. And beginning tomorrow, you better know your lines. I know you could almost hear the gasps from the members of the cast that I was near when that word came up. But it was something that was a good decision. They did come in much better prepared, very much better prepared.
The sets, I think it's Bensonoff who says, was it shot with a wide-angle lens? How the sets, as I recall watching the show when I was a kid,
Well,
seemed very large.
Well,
but
they did, but a wide angle helps, but that doesn't necessitate using a fixed wide angle lens, because we made great use of zooms, because the zoom gives you all the lengths that you want. And of course, the zoom also gives you the added advantage of, for emphasis of cutting and going close into somebody's face, actually on camera live, seeing the zoom take place. It wasn't cutting away and then coming back when the close-up was already up on the screen. You could see it occur, and it generates a sense of excitement and involving in what's happening, and that was something in which the producer and I had a couple of arguments, but it's not a good idea to argue with your producer. But
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that it's when it shifted from color. It was originally in black and white, and it shifted to color, because a lot of the original Universal horror films, for instance, were in black and white. But then Hammer Films was in the 1950s was congratulated on the lurid colors that they used. It certainly allowed for a lot more blood. Now, Tim Lucas, in a recent issue of Video Watchdog, talked about when Barnabas first takes a victim, there's just a lot more blood than there was in subsequent times that happened. And he wonders if standards and practices at ABC became involved with the show because of the blood. Do you have any recollection of that?
I wish I could give you information on that, but I really can't.
Were you ever told to tone down the blood, or?
Never.
All of the episodes you directed were in color.
Yeah,
right.
But I never did. I never had such a directive given to me at all. But the use of wide angles is, the illusion that you get. If you were to stand there with a still camera and take a picture of us, if you're standing there, you get a different sense of depth than you would if you were standing way back there on the other side of the room. And the wide angle, emphasizes the things that are nearer. It distorts them really in many ways. And you have to be careful that you don't seem to be distorting as a self-conscious thing. It can seem that way if you're overdoing it. But the flexibility of a zoom lens, and the lenses, by the time I was involved, the lenses were incredibly sharp, and they had a zoom capacity at that time of 30-1, which doesn't impress people today with what you can get with a digital camera. But it was phenomenal to us at that time that we could have a 30-1 zoom ratio.
How many cameras
Three.
did they use? Three.
Three, yeah. We always had three. And I didn't look at it a great deal after that, but I have occasionally. But I have a feeling of pride of having been involved with the show, because I think that it was done better than a great many nighttime, just physically done better in terms of makeup and styling, hair, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was done with very meticulous attention to the proper element. Of course, one time I have to tell you about Joan Bennett was on the show, as you know, and Joan Bennett regarded her as herself as a mistress of Emily Post, and when we were going to have a scene that involved a dinner, Joan Bennett actually would come out onto the set before the camera work had even begun to check to see whether the settings were proper via the instruction from Emily Post. You almost felt that she carried this around with her. She was a stickler for social niceties, such as, for instance, the order of the knives next to the plate. But she was a very warm-hearted person.
Yeah, I should point out for anyone who's not aware that Joan Bennett was a major Hollywood star in the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s.
Oh yes, that's an interesting point. I'm glad you brought that up.
She was one of the first major stars. She and MacDonald Carey, I suppose, who started doing serial productions or soap operas.
Yeah, and that was done for obvious reason, you know, to excite audience interest. And children would be told by their parents, "Oh, you know, that's Joan Bennett on the screen." And the child could say, "Well, who's Joan?" "Oh, Joan Bennett, she's a big timer."
I remember my grandmother, I was watching Dark Shadows, and my grandmother came in and said, "Well, that's Joan Bennett." And I thought,
It was a very interesting assignment. I'm awfully glad that I was there. But it was, people wondered why it went off the air. I don't know what the real reason it went off the air. It was beginning to wear down its audience, perhaps somewhat, but a lot of people still wanted to watch it. But I was given to understand that amongst the writers, there was a real challenge in thinking up a new element to bring into the storyline. And you know, how many times can you have a character killed because his car has a blow-up and he goes off a cliff? Well, you won't have the same guy go off the cliff, but somebody else will have an accident in which he runs into a tree. And that, of course, terminates his involvement in the show. It was interesting. On one occasion, we had an actor whose name I won't mention, but he's a good guy. But he had a certain feeling of self-importance, and he apparently was causing difficulty in getting his contract renewed on terms that were favorable to him. And the network was being very, very stubborn about it. And so the network just thought that, well, we know how we're going to take care of this. And this actor was absolutely surprised when he arrived one day to pick up his script, and he found out from this particular script that he was going to be in a car driving down the Big Sur highway in California, and it was going to go over down into the ocean. Now, the silliest part of it, the ridiculous things that can happen, is that, well, it might as well, his name was Joe Patterson. But finally, the network realized that he had a lot of loyal followers. And what were they going to do? Well, they actually contrived something. I don't know how many people in the audience out there believed it, but they didn't write letters of protest. They had Joe, having survived that accident. If you've ever driven on the Big Sur highway and you go off, or you think about going up, you will never think that anybody could survive it. But somehow or other, Joe Patterson did. And there he was, clambering out of the water, drenched in seaweeds, etc., and we brought him back into the show, but on the financial terms that the network decided, not what he was after at all. There are silly little things that happen like that.
I mean, you were in New York. I was in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Okay, there was some feeling that the show was ungodly. You know, there was, and I wanted to know, did you experience that? Did you hear anything about that? I mean, it's a show about witches and demons and vampires, and you know, I know that there was some pushback. There were people who just didn't understand.
Well, you would be astounded at how many responses that producers and executives at a network will get. For instance, the kind of thing that can happen in television as well as in legit live theater. Some years ago, I was in a production that they did at Barton Theater, and I had the second lead in the show, which is variously called the Captain or the Statue. It's a wonderful part. But the producer actually received a letter wanting to know why ABC had the audacity to do a show about the devil, because the name of it is Don Juan and Hell. And this lady did not realize, because she had not read the play, yes, Don Juan is in hell, but he doesn't like being in hell, and in the play, he actually gets out of hell. But there are silly things like that that occur, in the people in the audience overreaching, distorting, not noticing exactly what happened, and then criticizing you for what did happen that didn't happen, but they think that did because that's the way they remember it.
Was there I mean, you directed 49 episodes of Dark
Yeah.
Shadows. Now, that's an impressive number, but it's only 4% of the
Oh, yeah.
1,225 episodes that were produced. Was there more
No,
or
but
less
I left the show in '68. Remember, we
Yeah.
left in '71.
Was there, when you were directing, was there sort of a house style? Because I know Jeff Thompson has written several books where he talks about Dan Curtis liking to use. Dan Curtis, you directed more than episodes than Dan Curtis directed, the show's creator. But that Dan Curtis enjoyed using like low angle shots to create a sense of claustrophobia. Did you have a sense that there was a house style in terms of how you should direct a particular episode?
Well, I think that interesting camera angles were. That was a subject that we were cognizant of. We did want to make the visual exciting, interesting, captivating, however you want to put it. And of course, where this was exploited best in all of show business history was in that wonderful movie Citizen Kane, which introduced low camera angles in a way that had never been used before. Orson Welles deserves a lot of credit for the development of camera shooting styles. He accomplished a lot with that. He showed us how a lot of things should be done. And I'm glad that he did. It made for more interest in doing the show, and I'm sure it made for more interest for the performers in the show. Anyway, the whole issue of that you're bringing up is whether there was a sense of code about how things should be handled.
Or consistency.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say it was a mandatory thing, always to use low angles or something or other. You would use one if it were interesting, but it wasn't a matter of trying to find low angles. Very often you would find out that was a good approach. There's another interesting thing about camera composition, which is that the standard way of shooting in photography, still photography, whatever, is if you have two images on the screen, two people, let me say, and one is on the right and the other is on the left. And if you're cutting back and forth from one camera to another, what you have to do is twist your head like this, unless you avoid the problem of handling that very simply by putting the subject camera center, always center. You will notice in many TV, particularly daytime dramas, that there's just a sort of routine assignment of, in the composing a camera shot, of putting the actor's head center, because then the audience doesn't have to go like this, because in one shot it's over there and the other shot is here, and it provides for visual continuity. It's a sort of thread, a visual thread, you might say.
Well, I just wanted to congratulate the show on its use of lighting, because although the show frequently took place at night, in terms of the show's context, obviously, because it deals with vampires and witches, it was always possible to see the action, and that's a problem that I notice with a lot of contemporary shows, where the darkness is dark. I can't see anything.
Well, there's one thing which has amused me, and I've talked to people about it, and I've said, do you know what causes lightning and thunder? Well, I say, actually, lightning occurs has nothing to do about static electricity. It has to do whether a camera is going to pan across a room and suddenly see an open window in a nighttime scene. And the instant it hit that open window, I would say, lightning! And lightning! Thunder! And those were mysteries of weather forecasting, you might say. I mean, you could look at a script and you could say, man, how many times are we going to have to, use lightning and thunder in this particular installment? But that amused me as a kind of weather forecasting, and it's very interesting.
I have to ask you, your directorial credit is always listed as Sean Dew Sullivan.
Oh.
I'm assuming, is that Gaelic for black? Are you saying
Yes,
you're black
it
Sean
is
Sullivan?
It very much.
Is that a political statement?
No,
or
no, it's not that. I ended up having a nickname that was given to me by my grandfather, who had a brother. He came from a very Irish family, who had a brother older than he was. And his brother had a family nickname of Sean Rue, which means a redhead, John with the red hair. And my older brothers had been reading Lady of the Lake. This is silly. And in it, a central character is Roderick Dhu, and it was explained in the footnotes that meant Black Roderick. And so my older brothers, having read the footnotes, which they all would do, pointed out to my grandfather, his hair, our kid brother's hair is not red, it's black, Granddaddy. And so, at any rate, they decided that they would steal something from the Lady of the Lake, and they would change my nickname to Sean Dew, which is, for spelling, as I use it, it is spelled D-H-U. Now, the Irish language, like Latin, has cases. It has nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, adjective. So D-H-U really is the genitive. And if somebody were named, nobody in the Irish context would be named O'Sullivan Dew, spelled D-H-U. If it were a possessive such as of Sullivan, then you would use the do, but spelled D-H-U, which comes from D-U-B-H, which is pronounced duv with the V. The interesting thing about it is that you've all heard of the name of the city of Dublin. And Dublin actually is derived from two Irish words, one of which is dew, for black, and the Lynn part is derived from the Irish word lean, which means lake, pond, something like that. So you might say that the essential inner meaning of the name Dublin is something like Blackpool. And the funny thing is that just across the Irish Sea is a town named Blackpool. But that's the origin of my using that name. And my name is listed with Actors Equity is Sean O'Sullivan. I've used Sean Dew Sullivan because that's a family nickname, and I kind of like it. It has emotional connection for me, but properly it is not spelled correctly. And when you just say O'Sullivan Dew with a D-U-B-H, because the D-U-B-H is I'm getting into nominatives and datives and so on. I'm sorry, I went too far into that. But you opened up a little box here for me.
Well.
And now here I am wandering around inside it. Now what do I do? Where do I go?
Well, you can tell me why your involvement with the show, your particular, the last episode you directed was one that more or less ended a story arc.
Yeah.
Where Nicholas Blair is sent back to hell and Barnabas smiles over this. And that was the last episode you directed.
Yep.
Why did your involvement end? Did your involvement end with the show at that point, or were you otherwise involved?
Yes, my involvement with the show ended at that time. And of course, I don't want to use subterfuge here. That was because of a difference of opinion between me and the producer. Don't have differences of opinion with the producer. Whatever you do, keep your mouth shut. But I went on to work on other things, and then I was assigned to work on a show called One Life to Live. And I ended up working on that as a director and or associate director for close to 13 years, 12 and a half years. And that was a very, very successful daytime show.
Well, my producer, you say not argue with the producer. My producer is saying that we have to wrap this up, and I would like to thank Sean Sullivan for being with us today. And I appreciate your coming, and
well, thank you
I
very
hope
much.
we can have other conversations about this in the near future.
I certainly hope so. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. The Sean Sullivan Interview is a Robert Chamberlain production.